Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point.
Hello, everyone. This week's guest on the Turning Point podcast is Dr. Justin Baker. He's the co-founder of Still Point Insight, a doctor of human factors and ergonomics, my business partner, and a close friend. I wanted to put Justin in the guest seat this week because I think most of our clients know Justin as this empathetic, grounding human element of our business. He's the one constantly asking, is this doable? And how will this fit into your work or life? And singing praises when clients accomplish big or little tasks. But I don't think people know the story of how he became so considerate and intentional. I don't think they know the way he grew up as a restless kid in Detroit and how competitive sports were actually a lifeline, and how the early portion of his career in advertising sowed the seeds that germinated into a mindfulness practice that eventually led to a PhD. So in this episode, I want to dig into his turning point, his theory of change, and more importantly, how he leverages those insights to help mission-driven individuals and organizations. So take a breath, settle in, and let's dive in to The Turning Point with Dr. Justin Baker. Justin Baker, welcome to The Turning Point.
Happy to be here, boss.
All right, appreciate it. Let's dive in. So you have led a lot of lives. And, perhaps I know you better than most of our listeners, but you grew up in Detroit. Mm-hmm. You have a background in competitive tennis, a professional career in advertising. You've been deep into the Vipassana meditation rabbit hole. You've taught mindfulness. You've pursued a PhD. You've completed a PhD, and now we're here together. So I'm curious if we can just rewind the clock a bit. Let's go back to your time growing up in Detroit. You've told me in the past that tennis was an outlet for you as a kid to really stay focused, right? Mm-hmm. What prompted you to go from this kind of like hyper-competitive tennis player on the straight and narrow into embracing mindfulness?
Oh, okay. Wow, we really are going back. This is going to start to sound like a therapy session in a second. I'll start with this. I am naturally a very restless person. That's just baseline for me. Sitting still is not my strength, which of course is ironic considering how much I meditate and how much I've taught meditation. But that's often the case, right? Your own problems become the thing that, the solution that you teach, right? I was a very restless kid, and yeah, sports were a huge outlet, and tennis was something that was completely immersive, especially when you get into the high competitive levels of tennis, which as a restless and pretty obsessive, hyper-focused kid, I certainly did. That was a solve for me. Because I had to be very dedicated to this thing on a daily basis. And then, even in college, right? I went to the University of Wisconsin, widely known as one of the great party schools in America. If I didn't have to have my act together, every afternoon to be training with my team and competing on weekends, that could have gone in a different direction for me. Mm-hmm. So,
well, I'm curious, was there like a moment, when you found mindfulness or meditation and you kind of knew, okay, I'm going to use this as an anchor point moving forward?
Yeah. So I would describe the first 25 years of my life as the solution to my restlessness and my like carrot chasing habitual mentality was work hard and play hard. Right? I spent that energy and just kept it going in a cycle. And that works when you are a college athlete and you have school and you have your sport and you have your social life. But then you get into the real world. And I legitimately tried to choose the most overstimulating and high intensity career that I could, which was advertising. I thought, this is where the action is. It'll be fast paced. I'll be doing new things all of the time. It'll keep me stimulated and interested. But that's not a way to live an adult life. And so when I see former athletes, I guess the classic case being somebody like Michael Jordan, who like seems to have trouble adjusting to life off the court, where he's not like settling scores and, out competing somebody every day, right? In the real world, you have to form partnerships. Things move slower. And so even in a really hyperactive and somewhat toxic industry like advertising, I started to feel like a race car being forced to move around in first gear in a 25-mile-per-hour residential zone. And it was really uncomfortable. And what started out as just restlessness and relentless action quickly turned into chronic anxiety. And I had trouble sleeping. I had trouble settling down. In the adult world, you just get chronic low-grade stress instead of these high-intensity releases, which is what an athlete feels, right? You train and train and train, and then you go out there and you go 120% for 3 hours, and then, like it's over. And you don't get that in a desk job, no matter how hard you try.
It's very true. Yeah.
So to answer your question, I was in advertising for most of my 20s. And then by my mid-late 20s, I was starting to feel burned out, as many people do in that industry. But for me, it was a convergence of just how I was wired as an individual and the way this industry burns people out. And I ended up quitting advertising for various reasons and spent the rest of my 20s trying to figure out what to do with my life and how to resolve this kind of perpetual restlessness. And I eventually went on what I would call my mental health campaign, right? I have to attack everything like it's a battle. And so I got a therapist. I went to 12-step meetings. I'm a child of alcoholics. Addiction runs in my family. I was fortunate that I had just found other coping mechanisms and I was not addicted to any substances, but I could see these tendencies really coming to the surface for me. So I tried those two things. And then the girl I was dating at the time, she had done a 10-day silent meditation retreat and said it had like miraculously cured her anxiety and her depression. And I had also grown up with an uncle he was an original hippie, went to India, meditated in the mountains by himself, did the whole thing. And he was always just a curiosity to me, but the seed had been planted. And then I met somebody my own age who was close to me who said, this really changed my life. And I said, cool. I don't know if I can go to India for 10 days though. And she said, you don't have to. This stuff is in the United States. And there was a retreat 2 hours away in Minnesota.
Wow. Well, I was just curious. Could you tell us, how old were you? At what part of your life? You said you were in advertising until your late 20s. So how old were you when you learned of your first Vipassana meditation, and then how old were you when you went?
So, like I said, I had learned about meditation from my uncle when I was a kid. And I always just thought it was kind of strange. Who's my goofy uncle who went through a hippie phase, traveled around the country in a VW bus, went to India and met gurus, had a little meditation space in his house, but is now a lawyer. Like, who is this guy, right? But I always liked him. I always thought he was a great dude. And then in my 20s, I started to ask him about it. As I was starting to feel the stress of adulthood, I was like, if I wanted to go to India and meditate in the mountain for 10 days, how would I pull that off? Where do I go? And I just thought, maybe I'll do that later in life. And then it was in my late 20s. I was 28, 29 when I met this girl and she told me about it. And then the year I turned 30, a bunch of things boiled over. And then I was playing in a tennis tournament, trying to play in a tennis tournament as an adult. My body, starting to break down at age 30, tore a muscle in my leg, was on crutches. And I was on the fence about going on this 10-day retreat. And when that happened, I was like, well, I'm not moving around anyway.
Interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
is that coincidence or divine intervention?
I've asked that many times.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned this mental health campaign, right?
Yeah.
And like attacking mental health campaign,
Right.
which of course feels and seems and sounds incongruent to the idea of, um, I mean, a 10-day Vipassana meditation, for those who are unaware, maybe you could share a little bit about that, but like that's a pretty intense, you know, drop in to mindfulness. But you've got this intensity and you're starting to attend your first Vipassana 10-day meditation retreat on crutches. So can you tell us a little bit about what that week and a half looked like?
Yeah. And for context, you're right. Mindfulness is everywhere now. You download an app on your phone and do a 5-minute meditation, while you walk to work. But in 2010, that's when this happened. We weren't quite at that point yet. In the Western world, apps didn't exist. I didn't even know there were some soft over-the-counter options that did exist. You could do little, like an 8-week course, and you could go 2 hours a week. It's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. I didn't know any of that existed. So the only thing I knew of were these long-term retreats. And I just thought, well, maybe that's what I need. Maybe I just need to dive into the deepest end of the pool. And in retrospect, I literally dove into the deepest possible end. Not only did I choose a silent long-term retreat, the tradition I chose, this Vipassana as taught by S.N. Goenka, is probably the most austere version of one of those that you can do in North America. So you arrive at this thing, you hand them your cell phone, you hand them any digital devices you have, any writing utensils, any medications. Like, it is a pure stimulation cleanse. And then, you learn the rules, et cetera, et cetera. And then about 3 hours after you get there, noble silence begins. And you do not talk or make eye contact with anyone other than the teacher for the next 10 days. So you wake up at 4:30 in the morning with a bell. You meditate until 6:30 when they serve you breakfast. Then you meditate till, and there are instructions along the way. There are instructed parts. There are self-guided parts. But you are getting 2 meals a day. You fast 18 hours every day. You walk around a beautiful setting, usually somewhere pretty remote from the city. And then you go indoors and you sit in a room with anywhere from 20 to 50 other people, and you get instructions, and you silently practice a very disciplined meditation practice for 10 hours a day.
And then eventually you decide, I need to go get my PhD. So can you tell us a little bit about what that evolutionary process was like for you?
Sure. So there are a few steps in between finishing my first meditation retreat and a PhD. The meditation, the first one, really changed my life, really exposed a lot of the inner workings of Justin. When you're a serial carrot chaser and a restless one, all of your attention is focused outward. So I spent the first 30 years of my life out in front of me. And meditation taught me, there was something happening in here that maybe I need to confront, and really shifted my self-awareness, really taught me how to witness and manage those forces that were driving me relentlessly forward without thinking. And it was a big life changer for me, big game changer. And I went back for a second retreat 2 years later and came out with this inspiration that I was going to start teaching mindfulness to people. Now, I knew I couldn't teach exactly what I had learned in the retreat center, but at this time now, the mindfulness industrial complex was starting to gain momentum in the Western world. It was on the cover of Time magazine, if people remember magazines. It's like 2012. And there were these over-the-counter things, but my thought was, people need to be within a highly motivational context to really apply this stuff, as opposed to just generally sitting and meditating for 5 minutes. So I thought people who are already in their jobs and they want to do their jobs better are the ones who are really going to appreciate this. So I started where I knew. I started with athletes. I thought, I know I already coach tennis. I know athletes pretty well. I'll start with them, and I'll see if they can do it. And it was a huge surprise to me that people who I didn't think would be amenable to something like meditation actually tried it. 14-year-old kids who had no attention span. If I said, hey, If you can do this for 5 seconds between points, this will help you play better. I said, okay, I'll try it. And I couldn't believe it worked. And then there were other adult students. I had them try little skills here and there. And I was stunned. And it turns out there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for us Americans. We spend so little time trying to do things like manage our awareness and our attention that when they start doing it, the results are incredible because they never tried it before.
I'm sure there's an appropriate term or phrase for it, right? But like the beginner whose learning curve is more accelerated because everything is new to them, right? Yeah, so that's interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely a big beginner's effect. And tennis, the tennis players, no offense to them, they were just my crash test dummies. My own meditation practice had allowed my own idealism to really come to the surface. And that included, the part of me that was very concerned about climate change and the direction of planet Earth and everything else. And so in the back of my mind, I was thinking, wow, if tennis players who are completely restless individuals can do this, then people in like real impactful professions in the world can do this. And then I met a business partner through my health club who was a yoga teacher and a former school teacher. And I thought, oh yes, educators, what a great place to try this next. And so we started working with school teachers, and same thing, people who had never tried any of these self-management and awareness skills and were in a high stress profession took to it immediately. Like they really loved it. And we had a lot of success with that. And so we started working in education, and then we started working in education leadership, and I just kept building it. And it was, to me, it was always a very wide open question whether this would ever be viable, whether anyone would ever take to it. But as everyone knows now, mindfulness has become something that is offered everywhere and to everyone. But, back in 2012, this was a bit of a rogue idea. So I was pleasantly surprised at how it took off, and we developed curriculums and we started offering it more and more in white collar settings. And then your question, which I've taken a long time to get to, which was how did I end up going back to school and getting my PhD, was that I had a moment where we landed this great intervention with a school district. It was a whole year. And my business partner, Jen Clifton, she worked with the teachers. I was working with school administrators from a few different buildings around the district. And I remember, and we had a great year, felt like everyone learned a lot. We sat down at the end of the year and had a meeting with the leadership of this one school, and they were starting to plan for the next year. And I thought, let's see if they're applying what they learned. And it was like the needle had moved like a millimeter. They weren't really applying it to the way they were running their school and their organization. And I just thought, I've made a very big assumption here that if people develop these internal awareness skills and they become more self-aware and they become more empathetic and they become better communicators, that this drive to deeply improve the way they do everything will just automatically rise to the surface. And that wasn't what happened at all. And I was crestfallen, man. I was devastated. I had this and this is what happened, and this is what happens to everybody, right? You go and you do whatever the thing is that changes your life. Meditation, or you do a cleanse, or you do a sound deprivation tank, or whatever the heck you do, right? And you think if everyone else does this, it'll change the world. Everyone in the world just needs to go in the deprivation tank, right? And it didn't automatically transfer. And that was when I realized I need a new theory of change. And if I want to see high impact organizations taking these skills and then applying them back into the world, I'm going to need to really study how systems change works. I'm going to need to study how learning on this level applies to the group level and the systems level. And so I went home and I started sketching out what would I do if I went back to graduate school to like rebuild my skill set. And I live in Minneapolis. I started cruising around the University of Minnesota, meeting faculty. It was nice having a big R1 university in my backyard where I could do that. And after meeting a few people, I was referred to someone who ran a program called Human Factors. It was a doctoral research program. I had never heard of it before. And it was, Human Factors is kind of an esoteric field. But
go ahead. Interrupt you.
Not at all.
Okay, so you're talking about, you have this year-long contract, right, with this district, and you're talking about, let's see if they've applied it. And then you realize somehow I or we have missed the mark, right? It's not being applied. So there's something else here. And so you're diving into this thought process around, I need to study systems change. And what would I do if I were to go back to school and study systems change? As you're poking around the university and as you're meeting with faculty, at what point did you decide or determine or discover this is the program for me, right? You'd mentioned that program of human factors and ergonomics.
I had a prescription in my own mind of the areas, the disciplines I needed to study. I had already been studying emotional neuropsychology via my mindfulness teaching for a few years. So I knew psychology was part of it. I specifically wanted to get more into the psychology of learning, how humans learn and evolve, how they develop new skills. I knew I wanted behavioral science to be part of it, right? What are the low intervention, high leverage nudges that can help move people's behavior? And I knew I wanted the design discipline because I wanted to be able to think about how people can use a design approach to really evolve their own systems. These are all things I had come across over the years in my own research. I thought, if I can combine those things somehow, I don't know how I'm going to do that. And then I walked into this woman's office, Kathleen Harder at the University of Minnesota, and she was showing me the different departments. This is an interdisciplinary program. She's like, here's the different departments that you can take courses in. And it was educational psychology, behavioral science, and design. And I had just planned to do a master's, and I told her what was on my mind and the theory I wanted to develop. And she says, you're not going to get that in 2 years. You need to do a PhD. She said, and you're going to get more funding if you do a PhD, so you might as well do that. So I went, in one conversation, I went from, I'm just going to go back and get a 2-year master's to basically being in school for almost 6 years.
Wild.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that interaction. I can remember the interaction that I had with my grad school faculty before I was admitted to the program. It almost has a tinge of I was at the tennis match or tennis meet, and then I tore a muscle, and now I'm on crutches. And so, it's like one of those pivotal interactions that really changes the trajectory of your life, and you don't necessarily know it or understand the gravitas of what's happening in the moment.
Oh, there are more. Cool. There are more of those, Ian. We could, if you really want to get into the story. There's a car accident. The girl who introduced me to the American Vipassana retreats, I met her on a total whim on Match.com. These pivotal moments are everywhere, and they're bizarre.
Surfing the cosmic waves.
Trying my best.
It's a fun.
Try not to get thrown along the way.
All right, so you're going back to school to pursue this human factors degree, which is educational psychology, behavior change, and design, or design thinking. So I don't necessarily want to get too into the weeds because I think we could. I mean, obviously you wrote a dissertation on it and you were in school for 6 years. But as you were going through school, did you have any micro nuggets along the way, aha moments where you were saying, oh, okay, so when I get back into the working world, I'm going to do it this way, not that way?
Yep. So first, I didn't leave the working world. Maybe if you go back to graduate school when you're 23 and you have no living expenses, you can live on a graduate assistant salary. I couldn't. So I kept working while I was in school. And that ended up being a great thing because I was learning and applying simultaneously. So for instance, one client I was working with during COVID, of course, so burnout is big and people are contacting me. The same reason they always said, we're very stressed out. Please give us the mindfulness pill. But now I'm learning and applying. So I'm working with this leadership team and it's very clear to me that I can give them the mindfulness pill, right? And they'll come back to me we're doing once a month meetings for I think 6 months. They're going to come back to me and they're going to say, oh my gosh, we loved the meeting. We had such a great time with you for that 2 hours. And then we went away for 4 weeks and we couldn't do anything because we were completely inundated. So clear to me that the way they were operating as a team and the way the work was being done was the problem. And so I spent a lot of time with them framing it as leadership development, but trying to steer their awareness toward this is where you need to focus your attention. This is where the problem is. It's very obvious. And what happened with that team was, we did our 6 months. It seemed like we made some progress. 6 months after that, I went to a conference that was part, like their team was involved. They were the planning committee for the conference. They invited me to come speak. And I sat down with the woman who originally brought me in, like the first night of the conference. And she said, Justin, I'm quitting. And I was like, is that good? Is that bad? Like, congratulations. I'm sorry. She's like, no, it's great. But she went on to tell me that she had tried to implement everything that we worked on and she couldn't. And she was completely burned out. And she had gone to her doctor and her doctor had said, you need to quit that job. Your health indicators are all like red flags. And she was selling it to me as a celebration. She's like, thank you. You brought me so much self-awareness. I'm going to do this for myself now. And would you coach me one-on-one, on my career change? And I thought, well, good for me, but that's not what I was hoping to accomplish. So that was big wake-up call number one. And then I knew that I needed to develop something where I could help redesign the actual work itself in a way that was benefiting the people and designed with human needs in mind, which was perfect. This is actually what Human Factors does as a discipline. It's how do you take into account the human needs that are at stake and then take a very scientific approach to that and then design the process or the work around the human needs. And I took a behavioral science seminar, and I still remember the day the professor said this. He said, there's no such thing as a neutral decision space.
Okay, say more about that.
So people say this all the time, like, well, people are making bad choices, right? Let's say we're talking about that team I was just referring to. Well, this person made a choice to quit instead of stay there and work out the problems, or her boss made choices that were, not good choices for how that team was being run. What Human Factors is an empathetic way of approaching things. And that's where design comes in. Design thinking is often about starting with empathy and then reverse engineering solutions. So the premise is that nobody is making their decision in a vacuum about how to do things. They're not thoughtlessly making bad decisions. Chances are there's a good reason they're doing things the way they're doing them. They may not be the best reasons. They might just be responding to negative pressures and negative incentives, but they're doing things the way they're doing them for a reason. Nobody is making their decision in a vacuum. And so you have to understand the environment if you want to understand why people are working the way they're working.
Right.
And so
okay, continue.
Yeah. And so it's about, so the process that you apply from that point of view is understand the environment, understand the people in the environment and why they're making the choices they're making. And then what can you do to redesign the environment to shift the incentives so it's a lot easier for people to make the changes or make better decisions?
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, I want to go back to this conversation you had with this woman the first night of the conference.
Yeah, sure.
So it sounds like the way you delivered that, it sounded like a turning point where you thought, oh, that wasn't the intended outcome. How close was that to the end of your PhD program?
So that was the first in-person conference as we were easing our way out of COVID.
Okay.
So probably midway point of my PhD.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so you have this kind of aha moment, right? Of that wasn't the intended consequence. I'm happy for her, but I'm sure that sent you back into the lab, right? Metaphorically speaking, of like, I've got more grist to send through the mill in terms of this PhD. I'm curious, what's your thought process like as you're moving through the program in terms of how you're eventually going to apply this work? You said you didn't stop working throughout. You said you understood that, change needed to be made on a systemic level. The work itself needed to be addressed. That the mindfulness pill wasn't going to solve all the problems. You're having all these little insights. And how did they kind of, create this sum total of, hey, I think I'm going to end up joining a consulting business? How did that end up landing in terms of your professional trajectory as you were reaching the end of your program?
Okay. That's a good question. Two pieces. First is my theory of change. Second is how I ended up in consulting. So one area where you and I probably agree pretty heartily, Ian, is that change happens inside out, right? Start here, it radiates outward. I agree with that in a pretty full-throated way, but sometimes people are so overwhelmed with what's happening outside of them and how it's weighing on them that they can't do this. They can't do the inside part. That was the thing that I finally recognized. I went into all of my work as a mindfulness-based leadership trainer or a mindfulness-based stress management trainer. If you start here, like, you can start to fix the outside. Sometimes what's happening out here is so overwhelming, that you can't hear what's happening in here. And you just and your first step is you have to remove yourself, or you have to change the situation. So I realized that when I, as a consultant, am stepping into a very high stress situation, which was often the case, right? That's when I get the call. People say, we're all wigging out over here. Help. The first emergency move is to fix the scenario on the outside. So sometimes you got to go outside in. That was the big light bulb for me. I'm learning this system design discipline where I can do it from a human-centered perspective, but I have to solve the initial emergency to just give people enough space so they can start to be more intentional with how they're doing the work they're doing. That's light bulb number one. That's how I'm going to approach work. In terms of what work I'm going to do, two things. Number one, in 2006, just as I was quitting it, the same year I quit advertising, I read Collapse by Jared Diamond. You know the book? Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of us in the environmental movement know this book. So, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. We had Earth Day. I cared. I was concerned about the Earth, but I was at least sympathetic to the notion that as a species, we'd figure it out. Like, hey, we've been here for tens of thousands of years. We've made it this far. I'm at least sympathetic to the argument that we'll innovate our way out of this. So far, it's proven true. Then I read Collapse, and I see that it hasn't always proven true. We don't always solve problems. In fact, we have a well-documented archaeological history of failing to adapt to resource problems. Oh crap, we could fail at this. And now we're just looking at failing on a scale that is more massive than has ever been possible. Oh my God, this really could all collapse. And I'm reading this on an airplane. And I just thought, whoa. And at the time, right, I was contemplating quitting advertising. And what was I doing in advertising? I was selling cars, dude. I was actively contributing to like competitive greenhouse gas spewing. And like I was already about to quit advertising, and I was just like, oh my God, I'm out of here. But I didn't know. I was like, how am I going to start making a positive impact in this global movement? That was where mindfulness kind of connected the dots for me. Yes, like the self-awareness and the intentionality that is going to be required on the globe to start to make this movement happen. I now have a useful tool in this movement. How am I going to apply it? While I was at the U, another great, maybe serendipitous thing, if you're playing that game with me, I got a great gig at the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota. Shouts, love that place. So many brilliant people there. Big education for me. I was a graduate assistant and I was running some leadership development programs there. But what a great immersion in the most cutting edge science on water systems, atmospheric sciences, everything. And I saw how dire the situation was and how short the timelines were getting. And I thought, man, I have no time to waste. I can't stay in academia and do research. I can't go into education and like educate the next generation of kids. I have to go to the closest possible leverage point to the source problem. And that's either government policy or the corporate world. And I had a lot more experience in the corporate world than I had in government policies. And it suited me. I'm a teacher. I'm a facilitator by nature. Being in the room with people is really where I belong. So that just brought it all together.
Yeah. Yeah, and we don't, for the sake of time, we don't need to tell our origin story in terms of how we met, but we met at the U. You used a term or phrase earlier in the conversation that I actually want to circle back to. One thing I really appreciate about you is how you were constantly asking the question and looking with an analytical lens of like what's required to make this change at a systemic level, right? And I think about that a lot in terms of work process, but you think about it a lot in terms of people and human behavior. But you used a term earlier, mindfulness industrial complex. So we've heard this story, right, in this kind of narrative arc of your life. How is and maybe you wouldn't even use the word mindfulness, but how is the mindfulness that you do and you teach in organizational settings different than the mindfulness industrial complex?
I'm going to have to take this one in parts too. Hope that's okay. So when I say mindfulness industrial complex, what I'm referring to is the fact that it's become ubiquitous. It's everywhere, right? I guarantee if you Google it right now, you can find something about mindful juicing, at home. And to be honest, I think on balance, this is a good thing, right? The modern Western materialist culture is one of the least self-aware and most disconnected cultures that we've ever created on Earth. So the fact that we now have yoga studios on every corner in every town in America is a good development. If it's turned into, a commoditized Instagram thing, that's an unfortunate side effect, and good God, capitalism wins every time. But on balance, it's a good thing. What I will say is it's my way of expressing the story I told earlier, which is that just thinking that teaching people to become self-aware is going to solve their problems is a misconception. And as somebody who, I guess, represents the movement that is trying to integrate some of these Eastern practices into our Western ways of being, my take is that we have to be more intentional about how those things integrate. Just teaching people to have practices for being self-aware is not enough. It's a Band-Aid. If you're walking into a situation, an organization, a place where people are incredibly stressed, and tell them, hey, do this stuff for yourself, you'll feel better, you're not solving all of their problems. And you're probably not solving the core problem. When I was interviewing you a couple days ago, I brought this up and I said, you're talking about personal change. What do you say to the parent who has 3 kids and 2 jobs and the world is caving in on them on a daily basis? Mm-hmm. Right? Something needs to be done to fix their situation and maybe even the system that in which they're working. So that's the difference for me. I say, let's focus your attention on the real material problems that are driving your stress. And mindfulness as an initial tool is really just about being able to focus your attention on the most important things and fix those so that you have more space, so that you can start to ease your own stress, so that you can start to use some of these self-care techniques. But you can't use self-care techniques if you're just being bombarded all day with stress.
Yeah.
You said it yourself, right? Can't put a lid on a boiling pot of water. We have to bring the temperature down. Mm-hmm. So that's the difference in my approach.
So perhaps for listeners, the concept of applying mindfulness to the individual is probably, they can make that translation. They can make that leap of logic in their head. As you said, it's kind of become ubiquitous here in Western culture. But the concept, I think, of applying mindfulness to an organization becomes a bit more abstract. How would you define a mindful organization, and what are some of the traits around mindfulness in organizations?
Yeah, that's a good follow-up question. And it actually reminds me of the second part of your question before I didn't totally answer. The thing about what is required to make change at a systemic level. So I've been teaching for about 30 years in one form or another, teaching, facilitating. And one thing any teacher will tell you is go ahead and write up a lesson plan and then get ready to throw it out the second you walk in a room with human beings, right? You learn to be adaptive and you learn not to be too prescriptive and too attached to your theory of however things are going to work. And to me, that's a big part of applying mindfulness on an organizational level, is ultimately human beings have to implement this change, right? What is actually going to work? And so I think about, what do these people need and what are the incentives going to be that are going to drive them? And where mindfulness comes in is, what are we paying attention to, right? And are we paying attention to the needs of people, or are we paying attention to the needs of the bottom line? And can we do both of those things simultaneously? We don't necessarily have to choose, right? A mindful person is empathetic. A mindful person is very cognizant of the values that are driving their decisions. And a mindful person is, willing to be patient and willing to work within the details to meet, to balance all of those values and needs. And that's not easy to do, right? That requires patience. That requires a willingness to see and hear the needs of a lot of different people who might have competing needs, right? So mindfulness becomes very practical very quickly when you're trying to make change in an organization.
Yeah, so I want to riff on this a little bit more. There's probably some listeners out there who are leaders in organizations, and they're thinking, or maybe they've even tried and attempted before, okay, this all sounds great, right? In theory, I get it. But, if you go back to the story of the district that you worked with for a year, after a year of working with them, you said the needle moved maybe a millimeter. So, are there any quick fixes in this space? And if there are, what are some like really practical, down and dirty tips that you could give to somebody listening right now that they could implement today in terms of how to kind of cultivate this awareness within an organization or within their department or team?
Are there quick fixes? So I'm going to say two things. When I was frustrated that the needle didn't move enough with that school district, part of it was my expectations of how much an organization was capable of changing in 9 months. They all felt like it had made a big difference in their lives. They felt like they were communicating better with each other. They felt more self-aware. They felt like they had way more tools for managing stress on a day-to-day basis. And that was a big deal for them, right? They felt more in control of their situation. So I think the very first thing, when you are thinking about how a mindful approach applies to your organization, it's about setting intention. If I could give one piece of advice to any organization who's not going to work directly with us, I'd say if you can get with your people at all the levels that are relevant, right? Your frontline people, your middle management people, your executive leadership team, and you can come to some agreement on intentions for your organization. Maybe that ends up getting expressed as vision, values, what have you. But having a clear set of intentions can make a world of difference, because then you have something to measure change against.
And so so let's take this a step further. Okay, so the leadership team says, okay, how do you prevent or combat or be preemptive about, we're going to set our intentions. We're going to make them explicitly clear, whatever that looks like, right? We're going to put them in the employee handbook. We're going to put them on people's desktops. We're going to put posters up in the office, whatever it is. We're going to include them in the meetings, right? We're going to draft a new mission, vision, values, statement or thesis. And I don't mean to sound trite about these things. Like whatever intentions are going into creating intentionality in an organization are theoretically sincere, right?
Yeah.
But then human nature happens, and oftentimes we revert back, right? Because behavior change is difficult. So then what would you say is the next step? Get intentionals first, then what?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's why you and I work together. Because you got to operationalize change, right? Ultimately, the way that the work has been designed, the way the environment functions, is creating the momentum that is allowing everything to work along, right, certain grooves. And so you set your intention, and then you set some concrete goals, like where are we trying to get to? And that starts the process of noticing, oh, well, why aren't we getting to this goal? Like, let's just say really concretely, you're trying to lower costs by 10%, right, across the board. As soon as you set that goal, you're going to start looking at, okay, where are costs? Where are they coming from? Oh, look, like here's a variable cost over here. Like, why are we spending this every month? That's wild. And then somebody pops up and says, here's why we're spending that every month. That's actually really important. Now you're already starting to identify the issues. You're starting to identify the obstacles to the change. It all started with the intention process, but you have to turn the intention into action and then ask questions about the way things are working. And that's design, I would say lowercase d design, right? Is starting to look at why things are actually happening the way they're happening and asking good questions. And where it comes back to mindfulness is there's got to be an openness and a relative fearlessness to asking those questions and a willingness to explore those questions and space to do it. It's what you're ultimately entering is a design process where you ask a question and you start to get answers, and then you say, what would it take to change these answers that we don't like? And then when you decide we do want to change these, then you have to really create operations that are going to make that possible. And you're going to have to create concrete linear processes. And not everybody likes to do that. But now you're on that track.
Mm-hmm. You helped me have an aha moment where I was a mindful moment, shall we say, where I was able to kind of step outside of my perspective, because oftentimes in our work, I feel like there's a driving force. And we say sometimes, we help clients like hold space to do this work. But I think the aha moment that, or maybe it's just kind of re-solidified or at a deeper level, is the work doesn't get done unless you create the space to do it. And I think that is such an elegant kind of tie back into this theme of mindfulness that we've had in this conversation, right? It's like if you're not going to intentionally, not necessarily, you don't have to sit down to make the space, but if you're not going to intentionally make the space, you won't have the space and therefore you won't have the insights. And so it's kind of this chicken and the egg scenario where it might be uncomfortable to sit down and do that work, but doing that uncomfortable work is going to lead to something that's, maybe out of sight, like just out of reach in the current present moment.
Yeah, you said it with the chicken and the egg thing, man. And that's been the big wake up call for me over the 10, 12 years I've been doing this. Everybody does their first meditation retreat and comes out all starry-eyed and idealistic. Oh man, if everyone did this, we could change the world. But then you see there's a reason people can't do this. And you start to grapple with the real chicken and egg. And now I'm at the point where I realize we have to be able to bring the temperature down and create a little bit of space materially before people can even slow down and start to act intentionally. And then you're in the cycle. Okay, we've slowed down a little bit. We've carved out a little bit of space for ourselves. We can all take a breath. Okay, what do we really want to do for the next 90 days? And then we start doing it. And then it becomes very stressful again, right? And now we're in the improvement cycle. And of course, you and I are talking about organizational change right now, but how much does this apply to individual lives? How much does this apply to planet Earth?
Yep.
And I think this is the cycle that we've got to apply everywhere. It's been an education for me individually at the same time that you and I have been doing this work with organizations. Like, wow, I need to carve out this much space in my own life so that I can be intentional and take a breath and make a change in my life. Man.
Yeah, it's the headwaters, right? I mean, it's where everything begins. I think this is a story from, back at a time when I was still an employee, and it's just kind of this unique day. It was during COVID, like the building was empty, and we decided we were going to all take a day as a team and clean out one of the closets. And that, as I reflect on it, was one of the best team building experiences that we had, because at the end, we had literally created space, but we had also had this like informal bonding experience, that wasn't work structured. And anyways, we were talking about the chicken and the egg. I was thinking, but like if we took that metaphor further, we'd have to clean up the chicken coop, right? You got to create space. But oftentimes when you have a clean space to work in, which sometimes means you need a third, outside neutral party, third pair of eyes, it just gets easier to do the work. So anyway, yeah, thanks for the enlightenment. And selfishly, we could continue this conversation all day. And I would love to. But
I would love to add that cleaning out the closet is maybe like the perfect metaphor that for any like reflective team process. That's amazing. Yeah. I think we should turn that into an exercise. Like, is there a closet in your office that needs cleaning? Wink, wink.
Literally or figuratively.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Justin. We've got 2 questions we like to ask every guest. So I'm going to ask the first and then we'll ask the second, close it out here. So for those that are listening, we always like to provide a little platform for the guest who's been featured to ask for something that they need. Because we are a community, and as we've talked about today many times, it takes these relationships and these partnerships to support one another and make the movement move. So what is one resource or form of assistance that would help you have a greater impact in the work that you do? How could the audience support you?
So this is a pretty specific ask for anyone who's watching or listening. I really want a policy expert and or an economist to come on our pod and talk to us about the implications of this tariff madness that is currently happening. Obviously, it's a totally uncertain environment, but I would really love to have somebody on, and specifically for the energy transition. I know that these tariffs, particularly on China, are going to have a huge impact on the energy space, but it's, the energy space is being impacted in all sectors. And I'm just dying to have somebody come on who really knows their stuff to talk about this, not just for my sake, but for our community. So if you're out there, we're waiting for you. Come be a guest on The Turning Point.
Awesome. And then last question to wrap here, Justin. If there's one message that you could share with everyone out there, one thing that every individual in the world could hear, and if they adopted it would make a difference, what would you ask the people?
Yeah, I would say remember that this life project on planet Earth is a partnership. It's a partnership between us and all the other living beings, and a partnership between the living beings and this rock that we live on. It's pretty fragile, and it is a codependent relationship. That's just how it works, and there's no escape. This is a marriage that we don't get to leave. Robin Wall Kimmer, author of Braiding Sweetgrass, I listened to an interview with her the other day, and she said, nobody should be allowed to serve in Congress if they don't understand how photosynthesis works. I mean, this is amazing. Plants, they eat sunlight and carbon dioxide and drink a little water, feed themselves, feed the entire planet, and create an atmosphere. They give us oxygen. How crazy is that? They eat sunlight and carbon dioxide, and they give us oxygen to breathe. So my recommendation to everybody is go outside and just take a breath or two. Not because you're meditating, just to notice that the air you're breathing is part of a relationship with plants. They give you oxygen, you give them carbon dioxide. We are literally in a relationship. So maybe we shouldn't be like burning down forests all over the world. Just a thought. This earth was not inhabitable until some photosynthetic bacteria showed up 2 billion years ago and created an atmosphere. People talk about terraforming Mars like, ooh, let's terraform another planet. Earth was terraformed by photosynthetic beings. And it's the only reason we can be here. So go outside and take a breath and remember that. Sorry if that's a little preachy. That's just what's up.
It's all good. That's what the podcast is here for, to hold space. Thank you very much, Dr. Justin Baker, for your guest appearance on The Turning Point today. And on that note, let's all go get outside.
Happy to be here, Ian.
All right. Thank you. Big thanks to Dr. Baker for sitting in the guest seat today. And a big thanks to you listeners for the work that you do. Hopefully the insights from this conversation mark a turning point for you in your work and life. You can find this episode and others on all the major audio platforms, as well as on our YouTube channel. And we'll catch you on the next episode of The Turning Point.